Hello, Gerard. Nice, finally, you're in Ukraine, so nice to see you here. And for those who don't know, we have a long story of cooperation between our institutions in Canada and Ukraine, and between professors in these institutions, and particularly with you, Gerard. And we really appreciate what are you doing for Ukraine, with your advocacy of Ukraine in the university in Canada. Today is 2024, May 2024, and your book was published not so long time ago, and even there is a story of one Ukrainian leader, of Pastor Gennady Makhnenko, in your book, which you recorded, I guess.
I'm already tearing up. That was such a remarkable interview.
Yeah, that was really great, and we did it in May, I guess, of 2022.
Yeah, not later. It was. I remember this distinctly, and thank you, Andriy, for making that happen. He sat not too far from Mariupol, the front line. The war was just weeks. A burned tree close to the river. It was a sunny day. And the one thing that we'll never forget is that the tree, although it was burned, you saw the buds, right? It was little greenery. And one of the things that we talked to the pastor was, how can you be hopeful in an environment like this? And he was talking about life and spring, and after the dark hours, there's always light. And that deep sense of optimism, I thought, was just remarkable. And what a privilege to feature him in the book.
Yeah, great, and such a privilege to have you in Ukraine.
Thank you.
Our team prepared the list of questions, but as we talked with you, that we wouldn't like to make it an interview, but it was a conversation. Well, as you may know, today is Monday. Until Friday, we're like rock stars. We have a tournée through Ukraine, and the main topic of all these events will be the leadership crisis. And actually, we were sitting with our vice director, Sofia Opatska, a few months ago, and we have a discussion. We had a discussion, do we have a leadership crisis in Ukraine? Do we have a leadership crisis in the whole world? And then our opinion was that yes, actually we have the leadership crisis. I was preparing the time for the conference. By the way, I was in shock that some of the speakers, because we have a pre-moderation of the conference panel, and some of the speakers, they was sure that they're not really crisis, maybe political leadership, but not in business leadership. You agree with the statement that we have a leadership crisis in the world right now? And another thing is, as we can see on the example of what's going on in the Western world, that Western leaders, they're not, they're much more faster, even though it's too slow for us, for Ukrainians sometimes, but they became much more faster. They're acting with much more courage. They are much more consolidated, as we could see them in 2022 and even 2021. So the question is that can it indicate that the leadership, in fact, can be self-regulated, or maybe regulated, not self-regulated, but then who regulates it?
Yeah. Okay. Those are great questions, and I think you asked me two questions, so I'll answer. Is there a crisis in leadership? It is easy to think of crises in sports, in government, in business. That's also probably magnified by social media, which is like a bullhorn that everything is just being talked about a lot. So the easy answer would be, it is relatively straightforward to think that there's a crisis in leadership, number one. I think some other factors point to that. If you look at the annual Edelman Trust Survey, you see that our trust in our leaders, whether this is business or governmental leaders, leaves much to be desired. It's not exactly high. And if trust is a foundation of strong leadership, then we have a problem. People don't trust the leaders. I would consider that a crisis. There's also this index, the ambiguity index, and that's up substantially as well. There is a lot of ambiguity and uncertainty in the world, and you could argue that it's probably or conceivably in part because of the poor leadership or leaders that are unable to deal with geopolitical challenges, climate, the economy, and people are not very good in dealing with uncertainty, and the tagline always is, the only certainty is uncertainty, right? So I think there's kinds of reasons to suspect there's a crisis in leadership, but that can be even more specific. And Andre, you mentioned the book that we recently wrote, that was published. And I think when it comes to good leadership, it is always a function of competencies, commitment to the role of leadership, and character. And from my point of view, we have a real crisis in leader character, bar none. So that's the first question. The second question actually alludes to, in this particular environment, can people learn? Because somehow the responsibilities on the parts of leaders are immense these days. I would say in particular leaders in government. And I would say, I think that these opportunities, these crisis-like moments, they offer great opportunities for learning. At my school back home in Canada, we talk about these defining moments, crucibles of leadership. And if people take the time to reflect, to deeply reflect what works, what doesn't work, how they contributed to, or how their leadership can advance a particular course, then I think those moments are great opportunities to learn about themselves and to really guide their own individual leadership. The problem is, Andre, that oftentimes as leaders we are so busy, we don't take the time to reflect. We're always in performance mode and trying to get things done. And there's an expression that we often use. Who am I becoming while I am busy doing? And while you and I are always busy doing, who are we becoming? More or less courageous, more or less humble, more or less collaborative. If we don't take those moments to really reflect on all the things that are happening in our environment, then these defining moments, or the learnings embedded in defining moments, will simply pass us by. That, I submit to you, would be a crisis to not take opportunities of those important moments that history presents us, especially today.
I would reflect on your answer, if you don't mind. So first of all, competences, commitment, character, as you call it, as we call it, 3C. Yeah. And I guess it's Warren Buffett told that how to find a best employee, that this person's supposed to be smart. Yeah. So this is kind of about the competences. Yeah. It's supposed to be committed, and it's like commitment, and it's supposed to be honest, and it's about character. Yeah. And then he's continuing, if this person is not honest, so that means that first two, it's about nothing. And I remember, and we have a question about that, by the way, that your model was the result of the research which you, together with Mary Cross and Jeffrey Gons, we did in 2008, 2009, which you were trying to see if the financial crisis was actually, at least, it was so deep and it was so worldwide because of the leaders and etc., etc., etc. And I would wonder, because I'm not sure if the information which I have, if it's significant, but those business school programs, which is so in mid of 2000, they was mostly concentrated on finance, marketing, sales, but not so many about reflection, ethical leadership, corporate social responsibility, and things like that. Am I right or not really?
I think you're right. When we started to delve into this notion around leader character, there were very few academic institutions where this was front and center. And, academic institutions, business schools have always talked mostly about kind of the competencies that people need to possess. And they're not unimportant. They're essential. But they're not sufficient. They're necessary, right? But not sufficient. And it is always kind of that, as you said, that combination. Because think about this. If I teach you only the technical skills of your vocation, where does judgment reside? And judgment, of course, is a key part of character. So I would say it's both the technical skills as well as kind of the character, which, as you know, is that combination of different virtues, like judgment, like humanity, like humility, like courage, like accountability, integrity, drive, and so much more. And there's that combination, that cocktail of the 3 C's that I believe, that I know actually produces good, if not great, leadership.
We have this combination of 11 virtues, and actually my next question will be, as you may know, this I would quote right now the most famous General Zaluzhny, the most Ukrainian general. So in one of the interviews, I guess, he mentioned that the idea was that we cannot win continuing to be with the Soviet mentality, with the Soviet mindset. And actually, it's not only about army, it's about many processes we have in Ukraine, like in a post-Soviet republic, or even maybe it could be the recipe for other post-Soviet Union republics, which would like to become the part of the Western world, so-called Western world, like Armenia or Georgia or any other countries. So we talked already with you that the character itself can be only one of the tools. How can we change this mindset? And you mentioned already that still we need the commitment and the competencies. But what role can character play of the leader in this changing of mindsets, changing of the behaviors, changing of the approaches from Soviet style to the modern one?
So let's set the context. What I'm not a historian. I'm not a political scientist, right? I've never worked in government, right? So whatever I say...
But maybe you will.
I know, maybe, right? But I'm kind of a behavioral scientist that has a deep passion and interest in leader character. And if I can take your question, is leader character an important tool in fighting battles? I think absolutely, because if I can kind of generalize this, the smallest teams are not always losing from the best teams, the bigger teams. In sports, you know, you have upsets. How did that happen? If you think about talented people, smart people that start as an entrepreneur, and a few years later they take on big organizations. How did that happen? Because these big organizations had deep pocket, they're big, and somehow there should be an advantage with size. Maybe, not always. So, in that context, I think that General Zaluzhny might be onto something, because I think a key issue is to be flexible, to be agile, to show good judgment, to demonstrate situational awareness, and to be very flexible in the plans, right, that we may have. I can also think about sometimes when we find ourselves big and very confident. I think confidence is a good thing, but overconfident is a terrible thing. Yeah. It creates kind of arrogance. We might not pick up the signals, etc. And you know, you were talking earlier about 2008 when this work came into being, and so much has changed. You know, we've seen COVID, we've seen geopolitical changes, and there's one thing that I talk a lot about these days, and maybe this is of great relevance to the question that you're asking, because in the environment that we face these days, you tell me, and I know you cannot tell me, but who has the answer that will bring us to victory? Who has the answer that really tells us what COVID was like in the early days and come up with a solution, a medicine, you name it? I stopped, when it comes to leadership, let's stop talking about heroes.
Yeah.
Those people that pretend to have all the answers. That doesn't work in an environment like this. And so rather than talking about heroes, I talk a lot of times these days about hosts. A host. As a leader, you have to be a host. As a leader, you don't have to be right at the start of the conversation. I want you to be right at the end of the conversation. At the end of the conversation, where we have a robust conversation, looked at so many different perspectives, options, trade-offs, that all of us, give or take, feel very confident about the decision that we reach, what might be the best strategy, etc. But you as a host, Andre, you need to be comfortable inviting the best and brightest at the table and collectively, you know, work through the various challenges. I think with a mindset like that, humility, taking accountability for the decision, great judgment, bringing absolute candor to the conversations, right? That I think that cocktail of behaviors, or what we label dimensions of leader character, can actually be one of several tools that might give you an advantage over large teams, large militaries, you name it. So it's not always the smallest that is without a chance.
You know, I liked your idea about heroes, you know, because being a hero is about having an ego, and leadership, at least modern leadership, is more about humility than more about having ego. And the interesting, I had an interesting conversation with one of the high-ranked Canadian military a few years ago, before the full invasion. And maybe, by the way, some Ukrainian officers would argue about that point of view, but I liked that idea very much. He told that we're now working on the ethos of Canadian forces, and we are working on to take out the word warrior from the ethos, but put the professional soldier, because warrior is it's something about hero, and definitely sometimes we seek for the heroes in the battlefront, and sometimes they help us situationally, but definitely not heroes winning the war, but like logistic winning the war. Logistic is about professionalism. Economics winning the war, but economics is more about small level of corruption, for example. And corruption is always about the character. Well, because we can have the corrupted leader, really committed. This actually Warren Buffett was talking about it, like really committed, really smart one, so smart that you cannot catch him, you know, that like all the police, all the FBI, whatever detectives will try to find possibility to arrest this person, to bring it to the court. No way, because it's too competent, you know, for that. So,
well, yes and no, because we actually have seen organizations, admittedly in a North American context, where there was massive fraud, cheating, and eventually...
like Enron, for example.
Enron, right? Theranos, right? The blood scandal, right? There's quite a few of those where just maybe in the short term that paid off, but eventually the law catches up and things go wrong. It's really interesting also the point that you made about ego, because when we are doing research on this particular model and those dimensions, and you know, going back to humility, we actually ask people on a scale from -3 to +3, rate these 11 dimensions, to what extent they're going to be helpful, right? -3, very detrimental, not just detrimental, very detrimental, and +3, very beneficial. Both humanity and humility, a large percentage of business leaders still felt it was actually very detrimental to running a business. Now, I'm not going to suggest here that we should all be super humble, because at some point, you know, we have to declare our ambitions, at some point we need to make decisions, etc. But I do believe, I do know, there's plenty of empirical evidence as well as anecdotal evidence that indicates that a good dose of humility, right, is an ingredient for learning, and learning, of course, leads to performance, right? And so this idea, this belief that humility doesn't really fit with a leader is just bonkers. It's just not true.
We did the same research, we duplicated it in Ukraine together with your colleague Lucas Monzani, and we managed to see that humility and accountability within the Ukrainian business leader sample, it was #1 and #2, but from the end. They rated it as like less important for making business in Ukraine. And we were kind of shocked about that, you know. But definitely it explains what's going on with our society. Sometimes during training sessions, which we are providing here in Ukraine, and you are from time to time you're part of the sessions, we can hear from our audience that they think that some of the virtues are not relevant for Ukrainian society, even though we made the research and we saw that all 11 virtues are relevant for us, and even though we're explaining to these people why it's relevant for us, but I would like to listen to your maybe to your explanation, or maybe to your view of how these virtues, if these virtues are so unique, or maybe because of some cultural differences, it can be changed or some prioritized in another way, or.
So, to all the people that are watching, and Ukrainians in particular, I should suggest you're not unique, because we hear this criticism or this question in Canada as well, and it is a reasonable question. I still would suggest all 11 are relevant given a particular context. So let me give you that context. People say 11 is so many. You know, like I cannot even recall or remember 11. Why don't you actually narrow it down to 4 or 5, no more than 6? I cannot do that. I cannot do that because that entire framework is based on what I would consider good scholarship. And our analyses have demonstrated that these dimensions are unique, yet related, and collectively they produce good outcomes through judgment. All right. I also know that context is everything. And if you look at that model, you see that situational awareness as part of judgment. Context counts. So it might very well be, right, as I just said a few minutes ago, that in certain contexts, you really should be open to learning. Be humble, vulnerable, and listen to that information. I can also think of situations where at this moment, André, you have to declare your ambition. Because it is always trying to find that sweet spot given the particular situation, right? And so it is never either or. It's always kind of that context, right? Number one. Number two, as I said earlier, they work together to produce good outcomes. Imagine for a second, right? Said Gerard, go from 11, go to 6. I say, okay, which one do you want me to draw?
Let's take out humanity. We don't need it.
Okay, humanity.
We have war in Ukraine. Okay. Why should we have humanity?
Okay, you know? Okay. Here's why we need humanity. Imagine for a second, right, I'm a coach and I see you as a high potential and I think there are certain things you need to know as a young, aspiring leader. I need to have these candid conversations with you, right? Candor, right? That is part of integrity. Now, of course, these conversations are very challenging and very difficult.
For both parts, yes,
both,
usually.
Right? I may have to tell you that you didn't get the promotion. I may have to tell you other things. It takes great courage for individuals to sit down with you and have this candid yet developmental conversation. Nobody wakes up on a Monday or a Tuesday looking forward, most of us anyway, to that kind of conversation. It takes courage to do that and a deep sense of accountability. But here's the kicker. If we take out that humanity, that compassion, that empathy, that understanding as to why people might have been struggling the last 3 or 6 months, then my candor becomes just cold-hearted and I become a jerk. Yeah. Right? Candor should never be an excuse for becoming mean-spirited. If I want to make sure, right, that message I'm sharing with you actually has to stick, it resonates with you, then I need to deliver that with a dose of understanding and compassion. Otherwise, you will push it away, you will reject it. And if we reject things, we will never come to accept it. So I would say even in the most challenging situations, that notion of humanity is critically important, right? In a war setting, I can imagine, you know, as you know, you've helped me facilitate this course in Canada. It's called Leadership Under Fire.
Yeah, great course.
Thank you. We bring these dimensions of leader character, bring them alive. So that people can feel it, they can see it, because we can sit in a class and we have an academic discussion that really doesn't work. This is an expression, right, that the military leaders in this course with our students share.
We need to say to our Ukrainian audience that actually it's a really challenging course with really harsh exercises. Absolutely. People are not sleeping enough, not eating enough, and it's
stress testing.
Stress testing, because, definitely.
You know, when people are at their worst, we actually need them to be at the very best. That doesn't always. So this is a fantastic setting facilitated by the Canadian Armed Forces. Current and retired individuals, veterans. There's a saying there, mission first, people always. People always. That is the humanity piece. It matters how we treat people, especially in the most dire situations. So, no, André, I cannot let humanity go. Okay. Try another one.
Let's keep it. Another one. Let's, well, humanity, you've talked already humanity.
Temperance, let's take temperance.
Temperance, yeah.
Sometimes people say temperance. Why temperance? Here's why we need temperance. Of course, if you want to be a winning leader, it is everything about drive, that pursuit of excellence, that incredible passion that you bring to the role of leadership. Couple that with courage, because if you and I have set really bold goals, aggressive goals, That requires a lot of courage and drive.
Yeah.
However, in the absence of temperance, in the absence of a little bit of restraint and self-control, what are you going to get?
Burning out, first of all. I think as a leader, I'll be burned out. Me will be the first one, and my team will be...
Right. Yeah. Or worse, right? Reckless decisions, reckless behavior. There's no restraint. Yeah. And quite frankly, we've seen that a lot in the global financial crisis. So this whole notion around, temperance, restraint, and patience and self-control, no, I cannot let that go either. That is yet another example where these dimensions, they work together. And all dimensions do that. So would be next to important, and I know what people might say, that model is very idealistic. I understand that. Give me a leader where she or he actually manifests all those 11 dimensions. I can think of a very few. No leader is perfect. But two things. That framework in many ways is aspirational. We should always aspire to be our very best. And in our aspirations, we should always know where are my limitations, my weaknesses, things I should pay attention to, my deficiencies. I know for me, right, it is my lack of temperance. Although it's not a lack of temperance, but temperance can be a lot stronger. And I think for leadership and leadership development, it is that self-awareness through programs like executive education, where we develop this awareness and hopefully become a little bit better. So no, they're foundational. I understand that people might be doubtful. There's too many, there's idealistic. Sure. But you know what? It's contextual, number one, right? And in the absence of these countervailing forces, that's the wrong word, a virtue can easily turn into a vice, into a negative, when not supported, right, by some of these other dimensions of leader character. Yeah. That's a very long-winded answer, but I hope I gave you some insight in why all 11.
I have another question, which is a tricky or maybe even provocative. Yeah. We prepared the question. If you mentioned that there was a COVID, now you can see in Ukraine, for example, full-scale war, but the whole world is shaking right now because of war in Ukraine, and no one knows that this war can become, I wouldn't like it, but it can be Third World War or any chain of different wars and crises all over the world. Your model, you discovered in 2008. We've got the idea that you wouldn't skip any of 11 virtues, but maybe you would add some.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, I'm sure that you cannot talk for Mary and Jeffrey, but as you think.
Yeah, it's really interesting. And so let me actually broaden the question, if I may, because people have also said the model was primarily developed in a North American context, right, with a great many Canadians. Even though, right, we went to the United States, we went to London, UK, we have a campus in Asia, we did a lot of listening and collecting data. So I feel pretty good about the generalizability of it all. It is also based, and now gets a little academic, largely based on the work of Peterson and Seligman, right, who actually provided us with a lot of thought leadership about character strengths and virtues. And they did extensive research around nations, religions, etc. And our model is different, but close in terms of our general philosophy. I've always challenged audiences, if you believe something is missing, tell me what's missing. And I might say a word, but it is already kind of captured in a particular framework. So again, is it perfect? I'm not sure. I'm not sure if there's anything perfect in life. Exactly, but it is pretty robust. So that's number one. It's pretty robust. The other thing, of course, is, but would it generalize across other nations? As you know, we have an instrument that actually assesses leader character. It's both a self-assessment and a 360. We've used this internationally. And it is relatively easy for people to relate to those behaviors. Because if they couldn't, they would simply reject it. They would roll their eyes. That hasn't happened yet. So I like to think, again, there is some credibility in this particular tool that is inspired by that model. Now, Here might get a little tricky, and it is a fantastic area for research. There's two major questions. You know, I don't think, for example, people would disagree with this notion around justice. Justice is important. Justice has always been important, and that's oftentimes why it's considered a virtue. But justice in ancient Rome is very different from our justice, what it is today. Right? In a great many Western nations, we don't behead people anymore. But that was a normal thing to do. So the behavioral definitions that are associated with kind of those dimensions of character, so the dimension is justice, but what are those supporting behaviors? That might change over time. That might even change by culture, right? That's an interesting question. One of the things in North America, this is actually very relevant these days, is to say, but what about gender? Because if a man actually shows very courageous behavior, that's courageous behavior which should be applauded. If a female would engage in those same behaviors, she is overly aggressive. Now, that's a bit of a challenge because, you know, we think about virtues as they apply to everybody, they're exemplars of great leadership. But if you make these, you know, different attributions, that's interesting. And so that's one of the things I think we need to look a little bit deeper into. To what extent does this model hold up for the attributions that people make about behavior in challenging situations? And to what extent gender stereotypes might come to the forefront? So that would be a fascinating area for
the next few years with the research.
The final thing I will say that goes back to the time issue. Of course, the global financial crisis 2008. And then COVID came along and people talked, I could show you, I don't have them with me, but we can look at the newspaper headlines, right? That everybody was evaluating everybody, public, private, not-for-profit sector leaders, the way they navigated their organizations through this particular crisis. And many organizations or many newspaper headlines were around, well, this is an ultimate test of character. Oh, that's interesting because A, it validates that 3C framework, right? Character really is a foundational piece of good leadership. And then they were talking things around humility and humanity and this deep sense of justice. And we're thinking, well, ain't that interesting? Observation number one. Observation number two. Everybody knows what is happening in the United States. And about 4 years ago, the way the election was framed was around, this is going to be a contest around character. Even Joe Biden was framing the presidential race as a race around character. And so we're sitting on the sidelines, we're thinking, we were onto something, trying to insert character back into the role of leadership. And then, of course, I cannot let this go by, you know, where I am today, Ukraine, in the early days, and President Zelensky. People wrote articles about him in the early days that his character really stood out, his deep sense of courage, right? His temperance. The anger could have been so overwhelming as to what the Russian invaders were doing to citizens of Ukraine, but he always seemed to be even-keeled. Right? Certainly not trying to upset all those people he would need, the Europeans, people in North America and elsewhere. So there was lots to like at that time about the leadership of President Zelensky, right? And the dimensions that he activated. And so, you know, is our framework set in stone? No. Do we believe it is a pretty decent framework? Absolutely. Will there be an evolution? No doubt.
Yeah, and just wanted to mention that you told about different behavioral patterns for every virtue, and still we have a lot of sub-virtues inside the model, and usually most of the students, they are not reading these sub-virtues, and sometimes they're asking, oh, you know what, it would be great to have adaptability, for example, in your model. Yeah, okay, yeah, we have it inside judgment. Right. So the model is much more wider than only 11 virtues.
Yeah, or I would say even the kind of the openness to learning that might actually lead to kind of new insights, etc. So that's what I meant by it is either captured or kind of, You know, one of the examples was in the early days, you know, we were just playing with words because language is really important. You can have a great tool, but if people don't believe the tool is practical, is going to be of use to them, they won't use it. So in the early formulations, we had a word that love. People have always talked about love and leadership, but for business, people go, no.
It will not work like that.
Exactly, but they can live with compassion.
Yeah.
Like layoffs, for example. You know, goes back to the notion around humanity. Sometimes you need to make very difficult decisions, like impossible decisions, letting people go.
Like a story of truly human leadership, one of the cases, by the way, you're using in our classes.
The decision is, should we lay off people? In the end, they had to lay off people. People might say, well, but that's not fair. It's just, sometimes you have to do, but you can let people go in a very humane way, right? With explanations, great care, procedural justice. So yet another example, right, where all these dimensions work together to get great things done. But it is, as I said, the language is important, right? Love didn't go, compassion did, even though there's slight difference between the two, but it was good enough for these business leaders. Words matter.
You know what, I'm just recollecting that one of good friends of mine, he from time to time is reminding me a good lesson, and he tells that if you're telling the truth to somebody without love, so it's their cruelty. But when you have the deck of slides of presentation for a business school, yeah, I totally agree that it's much better to write that you need a candid and a compassionate way of giving feedback, but not love, truth, and it's good for the classes of philosophy. Sometimes it's good for business classes, it depends on audience, but mostly, yeah, language. And by the way, we have some interesting issues in translating of the model to Ukrainian language, like for example, collaboration. We translate it as a collaboracja. It's an Ukrainian collaboration, but there is another word as a collaborationism, which means to collaborate with the enemy. So yeah, and sometimes this word can, for example, trigger Ukrainian people, you know, because of our context, or temperance, which was mentioned. So it's like зваженість or vyváženість, but it's really close to judgment. So sometimes you're asking people what зваженість is, and they're not giving the answer. This is a temperance. Yeah. This is something about your emotions to calm down, which is actually it's quite connected. Right. Yes, with judgment, like all the virtues are connected. Yeah. But sometimes it's we had a hard time to translate. You know, to translate in a way everyone would understand it and would treat it as a practical model, but not the academical model for a group of philosophers who are sitting all over the world and discussing, you know.
But that was also important for us, right? Because I make kind of a little fun of that, but you know, when we started to work on this particular model, there was plenty of empirical research. Some of it was helpful, some of it was not helpful at all. And then we started to talk to a lot of leaders in the public, private, not-for-profit sector, a lot of listening, a lot of data collection, and ultimately it was their voice that is captured in our model. And if you look at the model, you see the words and the dimensions are pretty relatively straightforward for North Americans, Canadians, Americans, etc. But it was also very important to come up with specific behaviors. So there was nothing super academic about the model, right? So that is actually one of the strengths. I always share the story that one of the biggest compliments I think I ever received about this model is I'm talking to a bunch of people in human resources management, and I was getting close to the time I was supposed to finish, and we did a Q&A, and one lady, she was the last person, said, I don't have a question, I just have a comment. That she was in the business of coaching hockey girls, hockey girls, ice hockey, right? Girls team, Canada. And she always considered her responsibility to teach the girls lessons about life, leadership, and being good people. And she knew how important that the concept around character is, but she never found the right words and the right language. And see, all of that contained in one particular framework, to her, that was such a big win. And to us, there was such a compliment, because it was almost like, you know, we achieved our objective to offer to people, leaders, managers, a framework that they can relate to in terms of their language is crystal clear, you know, what character is and what it isn't. So I always thought that was, you know, very important. Because at the end of the day, André, you and I can have all kinds of conversations about character. We can think it's important, but to go from thinking and talking about character to actually do something about it, we need a conversation piece, we need a tool, we need an instrument that people can relate to, and I think we've achieved that.
Definitely, and I can tell you that we have a lot of feedback, similar feedback here in Ukraine, especially available for us, feedback from military leaders, and one of them was, by the way, Dmitro Bukharyov. He was killed in Olenivka. He's from Azov regiment. Now it's a Azov brigade, and when we started our research in military leadership in 2017, he was one of the first whom we showed the model, and he told, like, wow, finally I see the model which includes everything I was thinking about. Yeah. So yeah, the model itself, I've told that this is the tricky and provocative question, but I agree with you that it's for nowadays, for the context of modern world, this 11 virtues is more than enough, but still it can evaluate. Yeah. And yeah, because the world is changing, context is changing, people are changing, the models are changing. My last question for today, you know, you are recognized as the global international professional in organizational behavior. You're traveling a lot, you know, I'm writing a letter for you, okay, Gerard, I would like to have a meeting with you, and like plus 4 hours, minus 8 hours, because you're in Canada or in Hong Kong, all the time you're somewhere. Yeah. And I can assume, not even assume, I'm more than sure, I know that you're meeting a lot and talking a lot to the different leaders from different sectors, high-level leaders all over the world. Some of these people are part of the interviews in your book. Is there any regional style of leadership, management, maybe some cultural difference are influencing the leadership in different countries?
That's a really interesting and thought-provoking question, André, and I imagine there is. But let me also give you a different perspective. I work with a great many people in a great many organizations, public, private, not-for-profit sectors, globally. Right? I've been in Europe, I've been in Africa, I've been in South America, I've been in Asia, I've been here, of course, the United States and Canada. Even in certain industries and certain organizations, people are very different in their styles and their approaches. So there might be national styles, organizational culture, and then what individuals bring to the role of leadership. So it's hard to say that it's one or the other, but here's the real key that I think is the more interesting question. And I think that goes back to leadership and to some extent character as well. As a leader, you better be able to utilize that diversity of styles and the different strengths that people actually bring to the role of leadership and the different expertise. That to me is a far more interesting and important question. You know, oftentimes we talk about it as diversity. Diversity is a good thing. Diversity in points of view, diversity in experiences, public, private, not-for-profit sector. If you as a leader can utilize that and forge this unbelievable team with a common direction and a common set of shared values, you know, I think you find yourself in a very good space. Differences, I think, should be celebrated. Like, it's not a lot of fun if we all think the same way, because in our group of 10, if this consistently happens, 8 of you are irrelevant because we think the same anyway. I want differences on a team. I want different perspectives. I need the people that care deeply about the process, right? I want people that deeply are able to implement the bold ideas that eventually formulated. I want the people that can actually analyze and run the pluses and the minuses and are really skilled at thinking things through in terms of options. And I want people that are wildly inspired by ideas and push us in a different direction or potentially see new opportunities. There's all differences in styles. We all need those people. Put them in a team, lead that team well, And I think all of us would benefit from that. So yes, there's all kinds of differences nationally, organizationally, and what people bring to the team. But I think the role of a leader is to forge that diversity into a powerful force for goodness.
Okay, Gerard, very last question for today. And that will be for the end of the video. What would you wish or suggest or recommend for the Ukrainian leaders?
Well, it's hard for me to recommend things. I just have this wish, and the wish is a simple one. Absolute and unequivocal victory for Ukraine and its citizens. People that stand for freedom, autonomy, and democracy should be celebrated. And so if I have a wish or a recommendation, I know that you went through a lot already. I know that the world is asking, or most of the world is asking for a lot, which is resilient. But I hope that people continue to show that resiliency, don't give up. And I hope that help is on the way real soon.
Thank you that you're with us.
You're most welcome.